All right, so today is Java 3, Lesson 3, and today we're going over something called classes, but we're also talking about class methods and a topic called null. Right, this is a gigantic block of words. I'm probably going to reword this later, but classes and objects. So classes are another way of packaging useful information together. So last time we talked about static methods. Those were like a kind of shorthand, useful way to put things together. But classes offer a lot more detail with how you can package useful information together. So before, when we imported things to use for file input and output and user input, so like the import java.util.scanner, for example, we were importing packages and also specific classes that were included with Java. So that means that they were already with Java. You're just importing them so that they're there for you to use. So classes are something called objects once you create one in the main method. Strings are also a type of object. So if you can remember all the way back to Java 1, whenever you learned it, you can remember that I mentioned that strings are not a type of primitive data type. And this is where that comes in. Strings are a type of object, and so are classes, which you'll see an example of it. So object, which is another pre-made class included with Java, is a superclass of class. Superclasses will be discussed later in the course. Yeah, okay, going on. Classes go after all the brackets of the public class, and it's a thing on its own. So I can like point it out in a second. You can create as many classes as you want, and that's like the general rule with Java, usually. Classes can contain attributes, variables, methods, and constructors. Constructors, you'll also see in a second what they are. The public class, which is the one we've been writing in mostly so far, has to be named after the file as a note. So what I meant by that is that, so in a file, there can only be one public class. You can't have more than one. It has to be only one, and that has to be named after the file. But the classes we're talking about right now is ones that we create on our own. So these can be named whatever you want, just like most of the stuff in Java that we discussed, like methods and variables. Yeah, that was just something to help you differentiate between the names. So long implementation, but this is the general implementation of classes. All right, so first it starts with a keyword class, and this is where I'm saying that you can name it whatever you want. It can be named whatever you want, like vehicle, you could name it car, you can name it whatever. It doesn't have to be the same as the name of the file. And notice how this name is capitalized at the beginning. That's because this is also like a naming convention. And remember, naming conventions you don't have to do, but it's generally what we do in programming since it makes it easier to differentiate between different things. So next, in between brackets, like we usually have in Java, you can see that we have these weird variable kind of things. So these are what we call instance variables, and I'll go more deeply into like what instance means. But think about it as variables that haven't been set yet. So this is one variable. So gas is a variable, and it's an integer. And when we're adding like a comma, that means that we're just doing multiple variables. So miles is another variable, and it's also an integer. So this shorthand way makes it easier to like create multiple variables of the same data type. And then you can see we have a string here with the name status. So these are not all set yet. That's because it comes right here. So this right here is what we call a constructor. So a constructor is kind of like, it's a thing for setting variables. So we leave these not set here because we're going to set it right here. So particular thing about how you name a constructor is that this name right here, it has to match with the class name. So you can't name this vehicle and name this car. That's not going to work. You have to do vehicle and vehicle here. Same names. Public always goes here. And then in between parentheses, you can see that we have parameters. And these are used to set these variables since you need to input something, right? So these offer the values that you're going to need to set these. So you can see here I have an integer here. Int. You don't have to name these the same as the variables. These can be whatever you want. But so I have an integer, int j for this gas variable, int m for this miles variable, and string status for the status variable. And you can see here, this is where we set them. So gas is equal to g, miles equals to m, and you can see here that this is different from these. So the reason why we're adding a this dot status is because you can see here that these variables, they're not the same as these variables, right? They have different names, but this status variable is the same as this status variable. So to be able to differentiate between these two, we have to add a this dot status, which means we're talking about this one. We're talking about this variable in this class, you know? So it equals status, which refers to this parameter. Okay, and then you can see here that we have a method. So these are called instance methods. And just notice the difference between static methods and instance methods. The main difference here is that it doesn't have a static keyword like right here, where it was in the last class. And that's because it's an instance method. So it's basically the same as static methods, just without the static keyword. And it's also in a different place. But yeah, you can see that this is all the same here. You can use the variables. Yeah, that's something to note as well. So before in static methods, you couldn't use any variables unless you actually had a parameter with it. In this case, though, since it's all in one class, then you're able to use these variables here. So that's why we have a gas variable, a miles variable, and a status variable without any parameters. Right, so how to actually put these classes that we made to use. So a rule with classes is that you have to create it in the main method before you execute any of its methods. So these are called objects, and you can see that there's an example here of how to create it. So you can notice here that this is very similar to a variable because you can see that this is the type. The type usually goes here. This is also the type, and this is the variable name, right? It looks very similar. It's just a lot longer. And you can think that it kind of looks like the array implementation as well. So you can think of it as a variable. That's an easy way to think of it. So the data type part is where you put the class name. So for the class I had before, you put vehicle here, you put vehicle here. This time though, with objects, something specific you have to keep in mind is that it has the keyword new. Just like with arrays before, you had to have a new. It's the same thing here. You have to have a new keyword, otherwise it's not gonna work. Again, this is the variable name, so that can be whatever you want. So you can see here that we have something inside the parentheses. And these represent the parameters that we had before. So if we scroll back up to here, you can see here that in this constructor, I say that you have to have an integer, and a string, right? So that's what it's talking about here. Parameters mean that you have to implement something, right? You have to input something. So it's the same case here. In the constructor, it specifies things that you need to input. So that's why I have an integer here, and a string here. So you have to fulfill the parameters or else you're going to get an exception. And so also just make note that every single time you create something of a vehicle, you don't have to have the same parameters each time. I think that should be pretty self-explanatory from the methods lesson, but just to make it clear. So what's the use of these? So when you want to call one of its methods, like the class methods, like you can see here that I have a method here. Then we can just use the variable name and call one of its methods, and it will execute. So, for example, if you put c.printinfo, parentheses, semicolon, so printinfo is this method right here, and it prints out the gas, the miles, and status. Then you can see that the output would be 500, 1,000 in green, just like it is here. Okay, more on the constructor. So a constructor is where the class sets all of its instance variables with parameters that are passed in. If a class doesn't have a constructor, which is fine, then by default, the constructor has no parameters and doesn't do or set anything. So note, constructors are for setting things and not for returning anything. So when you're using a constructor, you're only using it for setting things and not something like a method. Methods are for methods, constructors are for constructors. Don't be fooled by their similar appearance. You have to make sure that you're doing the right things and the right type of thing. So also, if you're setting things in a constructor and you have instance variables and parameters that have the same name, then you can use the this dot whatever. So an example that you can see on the original example. Methods and variables. Okay, so the methods again are like static methods, except they don't have the static keyword, and they'll also just access differently. Again, since a thing here is that the only way you can use a instance method, like a method inside a class, is if you have an object. That's the only way they can be accessed. Whereas like static methods, you can just randomly use them. So, okay, otherwise they're basically the same as static methods. The same things you can do inside of them. The return types, the parameters, all those stuff are the same otherwise. So the instance variable names are what you'd be using inside the class if you needed to use it. So scrolling back up to the previous example. So you can see here that even though I have the parameter names here, and the instance variables here, what the name I'm using is the instance variable names. So you don't see me using the parameter G here. I'm using the variable gas instead. So just make sure that you're always using the name of the instance variables. So that kind of means that you don't really have to specify really clearly what these parameters are for. Only the instance variables you should try to do. Make sure that you're spelling out what it is doing. Getting off the page. Okay, so again, instance variable names are what you'd be using inside class if you need to use it. They're originally not set when you first create them, then they're set in the constructor. All right, public and private. So you've noticed here that we've always used public, the keyword public. So this is like more about public variables now. So public variables are variables that can be seen by everything, even in files in the same folder. Depending on what computer you have, that's possible. I mean, I think it's available on all computers. So private variables can only be seen in the class that it's in. So private variables are mainly used when you don't want another class to directly access it, There's a lot of different reasons why you would do that. So if you had multiple classes and you didn't want another class to mess with your variable, like accidentally maybe, then you can assign private, the word keyword private to it, and that'll make it not seen by the other classes. You can also use private and public with methods and constructors if you wanted to. If you use a public class in a different file but in the same folder, you can access it still in your program. So private variables are implemented by replacing public with private, or if there's no public, just adding a private to the front. So something like this. You can see here that it's like basically the same as when we did static variables. It's just private here, data type, name, value here. Difference between static and instance, another block of words, but we're gonna get through it. So static methods are with a class, but not an object. So it just means that you don't have to create an object when you use it, like I said before. So non-static methods, aka instance methods, are the actions of an object. So, okay, a way to think of it is if you imagine a class as like a person, instance methods are like the movements of that person, you know? So you might have a method named walking, then the person will walk, right? But static methods are like random things, you know? They're not with like a person, you know, if you imagine it like that. So only way you can use the instance methods is if you create a person. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So that's a way to think of it. So with static and non-static variables, instance variables, I mean, static variables are the properties of a class, while non-static variables are the properties of an object. So again, like the person analogy, you can think of it like that. Constructors are always non-static, which means that they're always instance. They don't go inside of static methods. Non-static variables and methods are also called instance variables and methods, respectively. Static variables and methods don't need to have a constructor and an object, while instance variables and methods do, meaning that you have to specifically write a variable with an object, but do not need to do that with static methods. You can just call them. Static methods are called by the class and the method name rather than by object. So I guess this is a long paragraph saying basically the same thing, but it just means that static methods are with a class and instance methods are with objects. Example, since I mentioned something like static methods being called through the class name and the method name. So for example, if you had a public class named A and a method, static method, named X, you use a.x to call the method. This is another way to call static methods besides just writing out its name and parameters. Usually you probably wouldn't do this way since you can just use the method name X, right? But if you were calling a method from another public class, which means like another public class in another file, but in the same folder, then this is where it would be used since you need to specify exactly which method you're doing, right? Null. I think we're getting to the last few slides. So, okay, so objects can be null, meaning that they contain nothing. So you probably heard about the word null before. It just means nothing, empty, abandoned. Example of how to set them as null. I think this should be kind of like self-explanatory, but yeah, so you just write the keyword null and it should be set as null. So if you try to access anything inside a null object, it will cause a runtime error. It compiles, but it doesn't run. So null pointer exception is the exception that occurs when a variable or a method of a null object is accessed. So, I mean, generally, you're not going to come across this problem since you generally would not put null as the value of something. You might as like a placeholder for a variable, but generally it's not used. So, in general, though, it's usually a good idea to just set the value to something, you know, like even though it might not be the final value, it's still good to set it to something just so that you're not going to come across this like exception. Get and set methods. So we discussed private variables. So since private variables don't allow users to directly access them, like from another class, we can still implement get and set methods to be able to handle them, like indirectly. So to implement them, you would just create a method in the class that returns or sets something. So with the get methods, others can see certain variables, and with set methods, others can modify them. Yeah, so there's not an example of that because, I mean, you'd basically just do like return variable name for get methods, and you just do, you input a parameter, and then you just do variable name equals parameter name. So I don't think it's necessary to like actually include an example of that. Yeah, so comparing objects. So we learned about like Boolean comparison things. But we're going to talk about comparing objects now. So to compare objects, you use the equals method. The equals method is something that's already set into Java, so that's why you don't have to personally implement it unless you had to, which I think I'm going to go over. Anyways, with objects, you can't directly use the equals equals that we learned in Boolean comparison, since it can cause an error because it actually compares memory addresses instead of the actual value. So, example of how to use the equals method. So, if we created two strings here with the same value, and we did a print statement with s1 equals s2, then output true since these two are the right values. And so, yeah, just notice how it's always like the first, sorry, my mind is blanking out. This is always like the first thing you want to compare, and this is the second thing you want to compare. Doesn't matter which order you place it into, as long as you have them there, that'd be good. And yeah, I think that's end of these long slides. It's a lot of information, but it's an important concept, so it's good that we're going over this so that you can get to higher level programming. Otherwise, that would be it for this lesson until we go to the class problems, that is. All right, so these are class problems. Again, just make sure you understand this fully since this is such an important topic to go on. It's mostly kind of programming question. Sorry, programming questions. But that's where like it's really important to do. So again, just make sure you do all of these and you understand how to do them and all the topics that go into these. And yeah, otherwise that'd be it for this really long lesson.